Hello, everyone. Welcome to Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring you interesting and timely information. Whether you are a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who's interested in learning more, we hope that you enjoy today's session, work orders, and dealing with maintenance issues. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, resettlement agency staff, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. You can go to next. Thank you. As a reminder for everyone joining us today, there is a control panel in your upper right-hand corner that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be time at the end of our webinar for Q&A. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any technical issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question in the questions box, and we can assist you through that. Additionally, the presentation and any resources and recording will be sent to everyone following today's webinar. And that brings us to our presenter for today's session, Lynette Harrell, Senior Associate of Housing. Lynette, thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, Joy, thank you for having me again. So let's go ahead and go into the next slide. So I think this is it's going to be a brief training, but a very powerful training because I think it's very important, Joy, and the reason why, especially when you're dealing with a population that is new to renting, especially in the U.S., one of the things that they need to know is how to handle maintenance orders and also work orders and what things they need to do to work with their actual landlord or property manager to make sure that the unit is in safe working conditions. And sometimes, a lot of times, tenants neglect submitting work orders, maintenance orders, or even things they can do within their unit to preserve it. So I think this is a very important subject to touch about maintenance orders. And I do know this, we work with sponsors and volunteers do work with refugees and newcomers. So I've changed a little bit of this language to make sure that you can understand how to assist your newcomer or if you're volunteering your time with a newcomer or refugee on submitting timely work orders. Next slide. But I'm going to give a brief summary of Refugee Housing Solutions because, again, we're still the new kid on the block. We've been around for a year. We are part of Church World Service. We are a project and funded by the State Department. So I just want to give a brief overview of all our services. Next slide. And after this webinar, or when you get some times, I just encourage all the volunteers and sponsors to go to our website. We have so many resources that can help you. And if there's a resource on our website you do not see, we're very open to take suggestions. Again, we are here not just for volunteers and sponsors, but also for newcomers, refugees, and landlords and property managers as well. Next slide. And this is just a high level of type of resources that we have on our website. We have our landlord toolkit and our tenant toolkit. I really want to highlight our tenant toolkit. The way the toolkit is created is for first-time renters. And the exciting thing is, even though that our tenant toolkit has come out, we now have it translated in 9 different languages. So please look for check in with our website because we'll be rolling out those tenant toolkits in different languages. Next slide. And then also we have our regional communities of practice. I encourage volunteers and sponsors to attend those in their region. This is a space where people from different capacities, different occupations in the resettlement space talk about best practices, network. We do have some upcoming meetings, so I do encourage you again to go to our website to see our next regional community of practice and become part of that. I've seen during the community of practice, people actually get leads. We actually have now landlords and property managers that are attending these meetings. So I just highly recommend attendance for volunteers and sponsors as well. Next slide. And again, we provide TA. We have a team of experts in different capacity in housing. So if you're a volunteer and you're a sponsor and you have additional questions or after this training, or you have questions in general, again, I encourage you to go to our website to receive TA. Our TA, we have one-on-one sessions from 30 minutes to an hour. Sometimes our TA can be ongoing depending on your issue or what assistance you need. Next slide. And this is just a few of the topics that we do cover in our TA. So I'm going to give you guys opportunity to review that. And again, we're here for everyone. We're here for resettlement practitioners, volunteers, sponsors, landlords, housing providers. We even receive TA even from other nonprofits that house high-risk populations to get best practices. Next slide. And it's so simple. You can book a session. And even if you can't get a session at a convenient time, feel free to reach out to me. I will have my email available and we'll make sure that we'll get a session booked for you. Next slide. So let's go ahead and just jump into our webinar. Next slide. The first thing I want to highlight is the lease signing, because during the lease signing, this is the time where a newcomer should find out what is the protocol for work orders and maintenance. If a housing provider has good practices, usually it's outlined in the lease or in the lease addendum, or they actually go over the process. So this is very important. When you're working with a newcomer or refugee that's new to the U.S. rental, you need to remind them during that lease signing, that is the time to actually look at the lease to see what is the requirements to submit maintenance orders. And if it's not in the lease or the lease or in the addendum, they need to ask those questions. How do I go about submitting work orders? What is the process? This is very important in the beginning because you want to start out on the right foot with the landlord to make sure there's open communication when there's issues with the unit or the house. Next slide. And I'm going to go over 3 different common types of work orders and maintenance orders that property managers receive. And the reason why is because it can kind of give you an insight on time limits of how long it takes to turn over. We call it in property manager turn over a work order. Your 3 main ones are preventative, which are regular inspections, upkeep of the units, and the reason why preventative maintenance is important because it does minimize repairs. And I'm going to go a little bit into how that pertains to a newcomer because there's certain notifications they will receive when they're doing preventive inspections. And that form might be new to them. They're thinking, oh, am I in trouble? Or did I do anything? It's simply depending on the state. Some states require some landlords to give tenants advance notice when they're doing preventive inspections or regular maintenance and upkeep of the unit or the house. Then, of course, you have your common ones, which are corrective work orders and maintenance, your non-emergency items, and predictive. And these are things that are scheduled as needed, and it reduces labor and material costs for the property manager or the landlord. And for example, that would be a schedule of the pest man coming every 3 months. Again, during that lease process, that's very important that they explain that to the tenant, not saying that there's actually a pest problem. However, because they have a regular schedule, predictive schedule every 3 months or every 2 months of spraying a unit to prevent those issues. So sometimes people get leery, like, well, do we have an infestation? They're constantly coming into my unit to spray every 3 months. No, that's best practices. Even if there's no infestation, that's how you keep it out. So that is what that type of work order maintenance that they will see. Next slide. And as I stated earlier, when they're doing scheduled maintenance, and it's called a notice of entry. And this is a form that sometimes can be scary if you see it posted on your door or underneath your door. When I was a housing specialist, I would have clients call me, oh my God, I think I'm getting evicted, or what's going on? I'm like, well, can you just walk me through what the letter says? So it's a notice to entry. And then basically, again, each state requires landlords and property management companies to give their tenant advance notice if they're going to enter into the unit. Um, I want to make this clear. Again, each state is slightly different. I'm going to pick on myself. For example, I am in the state of Missouri. If my landlord wants to come in and spray the unit, based on our state laws, they have to give us 3-day notice. Okay, because they're just doing preventive measures to the unit. So this is kind of what an example of what a notice of entry looks like. Again, they're all slightly different based on the language of your state. The lease should outline the notification period. That's why it's so important. Again, during that lease signing process, they explain stuff like this. So they'll tell you up front, when we have to do preventive maintenance, we will give you a 3-day written notice that we're going to enter your unit. One thing I want to give a caveat for the notice of entry. Now, if there is an emergency in the unit, the landlord or the property manager do not have to give a notice of entry. So they can enter the unit at any time if there is an emergency or they deem an emergency going on in the unit. So just FYI. And again, I'm gonna break down some reasons for this entry to inspect the state. Sometimes they will do this if there's been major work done to the unit and they want to come back to do a follow-up for quality control. I've seen property managers do quality control after the actual maintenance guys, so they will do that for reason for entry. Again, like I stated earlier, to control pests, to ensure that the property meets the health standards. And also, for example, to show the property to people who may want to buy it, or who may want to purchase it. I just slide that in there because this might pertain to a house versus an apartment complex. And also to show the premise to potential tenants during the last month of a fixed term tenancy. I want to go back to that lease. So again, say for example, you have a newcomer, they decide that they do not want to renew their lease. They gave their notice to vacate, and based on the notice to vacate in their lease, the landlord has a right to show that unit to a potential applicant, knowing that they're not going to renew their lease. But again, that's why it's so important to understand what are the conditions during that lease period when you're doing your lease up. Because there's time like, well, wait a minute, yeah, I gave my lease to notice to vacate. That doesn't give you a right to enter my unit or have someone see my unit. Again, if it's in the lease and it says once you give notice to vacate, we have a right to show your unit within a month of you leaving. So just FYI. Next slide. Again, it's so important when you're working with newcomers about the work order process. Again, this should be explained, the method of submission, because you need to know they need to know the method of submission, because if they don't, it can delay the repair. Some properties, they actually have a portal. Some require you to do it in person. Some actually have a paper request that you can go to the office and submit. And also during that leasing process, they should ask, who's the contact person just in case if my maintenance issue is an emergency. And all that should be outlined in the lease or addressed during the lease signing. So it's very important that they know the method of submission when they need a work order or they need a repair in their unit or on their house. I highly recommend this as best practices, especially as a renter. Tracking the work orders you put in. And the reason I say that from the perspective of the renter, not as a landlord, it helps you document what you had requested from the landlord, and it also shows the history of the units. When I do a maintenance request, I always take a picture of it. I always document the time I submit it. Of course, where I'm at, I have to do it in a portal, so the time stamps it. But if it's a written request that a newcomer or a refugee has to do, tell them, hey, take a picture of the actual repair if they're not able to explain it. Tell them to write it down, or you can help them write down what they're requesting. It protects them against lease violations, because the last thing you don't want a newcomer, especially if it's an unscrupulous landlord, if there's a repair they don't want to make, they can basically blame the newcomer for the damage. So this serves as protection for them, but it also helps them negotiate their deposit when they return on their deposit. Because if they say, well, when they're doing their final walkthrough and they say, well, I'm going to deduct this from your deposit, if they keep a history of all the work orders they requested, they say, wait, hold up. Remember back on such and such date, I asked for that to be repaired, and this is what the repair looked like. So I should not be penalized for my deposit due to this was an issue you should have addressed a long time ago. Next slide. So I'm an example type of person. So this is just an example of what it looks like for a portal. This is where I currently live, and this is how a maintenance order looks for a portal. Again, it can look slightly different depending on your property management company or your landlord, but I kind of want to give you an idea what it looks like. As you can see, it says create a new maintenance request. Tell us about the issue you're having, and please use as such detail as possible to help us resolve it more quickly. The more detail you can give your landlord, the easier they can help resolve the problem. Because if they have to come in the unit and try to figure out, again, that's wasted time. So if you're working with a newcomer, walk them through the process of just trying to give as much information they possibly can. And also, the thing I love about this portal that we have, we can actually upload the pictures and it tracks it for us. So again, not every portal is like this, but this is just an example of a more sophisticated portal. And even if you have a newcomer that does have to submit their maintenance order on a portal, walk them through that process, because everybody is not IT savvy. Not saying that some aren't, but some people are not IT savvy. And if you have a client or a newcomer that's not IT savvy, you can work with the property management company and say, hey, or the landlord, is there a possible way, a substitute that they can submit a work order outside of portal? Or is there a staff member that's available to help them submit their order on the portal? And I have seen, when I was the actual property manager, I would assist some of my tenants to do their maintenance order, because again, it helps me resolve the issue quicker when I have all the details versus I'm trying to explain it to the maintenance staff. Next slide. And I really want to, this resource will be sent out with the PowerPoint. This is a very powerful resource by Mercy Housing Incorporated, by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, and Department of Health and Human Service of the United States of America. I want to make sure I give them credit. They have this awesome pamphlet of how a newcomer or someone with if they have a language barrier with their landlord, how they can kind of explain the repair, and it does it with pictures. So I want to show you this so you can see what it looks like. I highly recommend this if you're working with, again, a newcomer. If there's might possibly be a language barrier, again, if they don't understand some of the amenities or appliances, they might be slightly different in the U.S. Rental unit or house. This is a perfect tool they can use to explain their need in the request, their maintenance request. And also, I recommend this to actual landlords as well. If you have tenants, not just newcomers, but if you have a tenant, there's a language barrier, or they can't read English, or they can't read. I've had clients that couldn't read. This is a great tool to use. So let's go to the next slide. And as you can see, this is just page 2, and it kind of breaks down the maintenance request. It has pictures, explains. I think this is a great tool to use. Next slide. And as you can see, the bathroom can kind of be a little bit complicated. And here they could just basically circle the number where the issue is, and the landlord can figure out where the problem's at. I'm gonna let you look at that. Next slide. And here is the kitchen. And the thing I like about this tool too, it does come in different languages. So just FYI. Next slide. And this is the living room area. Next slide. And this is the common areas. So this helps explains the common areas, especially if they live at a bigger apartment complex. And also I like the fact, like if you see number 19, say there's an issue, like they said, well, I don't even, now how to open the garbage, just the garbage, where I don't, they can, you can even circle that and kind of explain and walk them where it's at. The thing I like about this, even though it's geared for maintenance orders and work orders, you still can use this as part of an orientation just to explain, how to go about using certain amenities and appliances as well. Next slide. So hopefully that you'll use this tool. I think it's a great tool to use. And I want to talk about responsibilities because, again, even though a newcomer signs a lease, it is a legal document and it's a contract. However, it's also a partnership. People don't want to see it as a partnership, but in order to be a good landlord or a good tenant, you have to see it as a partnership, not just beyond a contract. And what comes with partnership comes responsibilities. And I'm going to talk about, in order for that partnership to work and to make sure that you have good communication with your landlord, they have with their landlord, there's certain things they have to be responsible for their unit too, because not all the maintenance issues is on just the landlord in the property management company. So next slide. So let's talk about their responsibilities. Now, it's their responsibility, again, to keep the unit safe and clean as possible, not to damage the unit. Sometimes things do happen. We understand that, especially when we have kids. If you ever had kids, they can cause wreck. But we're not talking about basic wear and tear. We're talking about just blatantly damaging the unit. It's also their responsibility to dispose of the garbage and waste properly, because you'd be surprised how that affects maintenance and the integrity of the units. Cleanliness does, especially when it comes to bed infestations. And also to submit timely work orders. How can a landlord or property manager fix an issue if they don't know if an issue is there with the unit or housing? The house, some people do rent houses. So it's their job to submit it in a timely manner, because sometimes delayed responses can cause the issue to be worse. So it's their job to tell the landlord, hey, these are the issues that's going on with my unit. And also to use the appliances and amenities properly. Again, cultural orientation should address that, but I do highly recommend, again, once they get leased up, you walk through the actual unit with them and explain how to use the amenities. Because amenities, when they do break down, they can affect other parts of the unit. And also fix things that they break or damage. Now, there are basic things that people can fix in their unit. They do not need the landlord to fix, or they don't need to submit a work order. For example, simple things. It's their responsibility to replace burnout light bulbs. Now, it's different if it's a specialized light bulb. If there's something that's questionable, they need to ask their landlord, am I responsible for either buying that light bulb or supplying it, or are you? I do know, like in certain units, the landlord does prefer to provide the specialized light bulb or do the repair themselves, so no one gets hurt, especially if it's it's high ceilings. And batteries and smoke detectors. That is one thing that they are responsible for. Best practices, I always used to tell my actual clients when I was housing them, always check your smoke detector at least minimum once a month. Make sure you have batteries, buy your batteries, have extra batteries, but also check it once a month, but also do a family fire drill once a month to be prepared. And again, notify landlord promptly of defective, of dangerous conditions on the property. And this just doesn't include in their actual unit, but if they see something that could be dangerous in the common areas, it's their responsibility to report that to the landlord as well. And then understand what's an emergency versus what's a non-emergency. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, when to call landlord, when not to call landlord, what is considered a work order that can wait or something they need to call immediately. And then month-to-month maintenance. This is a little tricky. This is something, again, that needs to be addressed during the lease-up process. And the reason why is because changing air filters and HVACs, I don't recommend a tenant doing that. I think, but I've seen it in leases where some properties do require the tenant to do that. And if they do, then they should require to do the training on how to do it properly. So just FYI. Check smoke and carbon monoxide. If those are in the units, like a smoke detector, they should check that monthly as well. And check the fire extinguisher if there's one in their actual unit. Next slide. And landlord's responsibility is to maintain the property and the structural component of it and comply with laws and building codes. That is what they're responsible for, and maintain the common areas. And also they're responsible to do timely maintenance orders. Once they're submitted, they need to respond accordingly to, depending on the issue. Now, some issues they have to put ahead of others, but they're responsible. Ultimately, that is their responsibility to turn those workovers over in a timely manner and to provide weatherization prevention and maintenance. Again, that's part of what we talked about, the prevention piece, because that helps preserve the unit or the house. And here is just a few of the weatherization maintenance: repair interior exterior cracks, seal leaky windows, insulate HVACs, ducts, like I state, water heaters, clean and insulate chimneys if it's applicable, and furnace filters, or replace them regularly if the person is in a house. If there's any questions about weatherization maintenance, they should talk to their actual landlord, what they're required to do and what the landlord's going to be responsible doing when weatherization is needed. Different seasons, depending on where you live at, different seasons change. I'm a Midwest girl. I'm originally from Chicago, so there was tons of times we had to do weatherization on our house. However, when you're talking about if you're renting, that's something that needs to be discussed during the lease process with your landlord. Help them discuss that. Is weatherization required when the seasons change? And if so, what as a tenant am I responsible for? And you as a landlord, what are you going to be doing? Next slide. So we're going to just highlight, because I'm looking at time, emergency versus non-emergencies. Next slide. So let's talk about what is considered emergencies. Next slide. Now, emergency is if the problem threatens the health and safety of the tenant, residents, or can cause injury or severe property damage. Now, that is considered emergency. However, there's some other things that can be considered emergency as well, and we'll talk about those as well. Next slide. Now, these are considered emergencies, not if a battery is weak. If a carbon monoxide detector alarm or smoke detector alarm is going off, that is an emergency, not when a battery is weak. We know the difference. And I want to explain it. If you're working with a newcomer and a refugee, you should test the carbon monoxide and the smoke detector so they can know the difference in the sounds. When the battery needs to be replaced and when it's actually going off. So that's one thing I do recommend, that you test the sound so they can know the difference. Extended power outage. This can be an emergency, especially depending on the temperature. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. Bug or rodent infestations, that's an emergency. We're not talking about you just have bed bugs, but if there's a true infestation what makes it a health issue, that's considered an emergency. broken furnace or heater in winter if the temperature is below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And that might change. I just put that in there as an example. I want to highlight, it depends on your disconnection policies for your state. That will determine if it's an emergency when it comes to winter and summer months. And I will, this information will be provided for you where you can actually look up your state and you can see what the disconnection policies are. And I recommend you read this because this can help guide you, not just when we talk about when it is an emergency, but also if you're working with a tenant and a newcomer and they get their utilities disconnected, there are certain laws that protect them during the winter and summer months when they cannot get disconnected, utilities cannot get disconnected. So just FYI, I want to add that caveat. Broken air conditions in the summer, again, the two examples you see, this is for the state of Missouri. So I just want to add that caveat. So again, this information will be provided for you and you can look up your state to see what is the temperature levels for winter and summer. Next slide. Next slide, Grace, please. And here it is. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. What are the state disconnection policies? These are the rules and regulations. They do vary by state when services can be disconnected or shut off during the summer and winter months. And the reason why this is put in place is to protect vulnerable populations, but to protect people in general. So the reason why I'm bringing up this disconnection policy, the hot weather rule and the cold weather rule, if a landlord does best practices, they use this as a guideline. So if something like if the AC unit goes down, depending on the temperature, they know it's an emergency because based on their state laws, a person has to have a certain temperature during a certain time period. So just FYI. Another thing will be considered emergency, and I'm going to say this, is no working refrigerator or stove. The reason why I say this, and this is if the landlord provides the appliance, not if the tenant brings the appliances, then they're responsible for that. If there's no working refrigerator or stove, they're responsible to replace that as soon as possible, okay? That's considered, in the housing authority, we consider that a 24 hour. You have 24 hours, especially with HQS inspection with Section 8, the landlord had 24 hours to replace that refrigerator stove in that house. So that's a best practices. Not every landlord or housing provider do practices, but I just want to give you top of the line practices of guidance. So just in case, if you run into this issue, you have a newcomer say, hey, my landlord provided me a stove and appliances and either or are not working. What am I supposed to do? And they're supposed to replace that within 24 hours. That's the best practice, okay? Now it's different when it's a microwave. That's not, now unless the microwave is the only means to cook food. Now, if there's a stove and a microwave, then and if the microwave working, that's a different story. So just FYI. Another thing is considered an emergency regardless if there's a window that's broken and the door cannot lock. Now that's a security issue. That has to be replaced as soon as possible. Less than 24 hours because now the person is open. That's a security issue. Flooding from a clear source or from a hidden one. Remember I talked about earlier when a landlord can enter a unit without advance notice. This is an example. So say, for example, you have a newcomer and there's water coming out the ceiling. And it's just coming down through their unit or there's coming in there. They have every right to go into the next unit or the unit above them to find out where this issue is coming from, because that is an emergency and is causing damage to not just to their unit, to the unit as the other unit as well. So that's just an example. And evidence of a toilet or sink or sewage or water backup, this can be a health and safety issue. And a gas leak, always an emergency, regardless of where the source is coming from. Next slide. Next slide, Grace. We already talked about that. Next slide. Now, it's very important, again, when we're talking about emergencies, this should be discussed during the lease up. They should have an emergency contact when something like that has happened. These are just a few examples because there's other emergencies, but for time purposes, I only gave just a highlight of the few that are common. But they should always have a contact information when an emergency happens. And I do know a lot of properties, they do have property management companies that do manage them. So when you are working with a property management company, you need to ask, who do I call when there's an emergency? I don't, do the regular maintenance portal, or I don't go to I do go to the office, but who is the person I call after hours when there's an emergency? They should always have that number on hand. And also you have some properties, they have on-site maintenance staff. So that's a question you can ask again during the lease up. If there's an online maintenance staff and there's an emergency, is that the person I need to reach out to and contact? What's the emergency number and who's the on-staff person if they do have one? Next slide. So we're going to talk about what are considered non-emergencies. Again, this is just a small example. Burnt out light bulbs, broken light fixtures. If there's no heat, if the outside temperature is not below 50 degrees, again, the example I'm using for the state of Missouri, so go back and read your rules for your state. Air condition, again, it depends on your state, what's considered, it would not be a non-emergency if it's a certain temperature. Minor appliances malfunction, including, like I said, an oven, unless there's no other source to cook food, a microwave, a one burner not working, or a broken ice maker. These are not emergencies. These are, you can put in a work order. In minor faucet leaks. Next slide. Now I'm about to go to some. I want to add a caveat before I go into this slide. Again, this is just information we're giving from Refugee Housing Solutions. This is not legal services. However, I highly suggest that you reach out to your your local legal aid agency if a newcomer is having issues when repairs are not being made. It does happen, unfortunately, so we have to talk about this unpleasant piece. These are just some recommendations. We're not giving legal advice. I want to add that. So what to do when repairs are not made? So the first thing is to help your newcomer review the lease. Go over the lease with them to see, okay, what is the time period for them to do the repair, and what is the next step, okay? And then if the repair is not being done, contact the landlord for an update. Find out what is the delay, because sometimes there are delays to work orders because they have to order a part. While you're doing this, say you have a newcomer and they say, well, either you're coming to do a house visit, even if you're visiting them and you notice that something has not been repaired and they are talking to you in general. And they say, well, I put in a work order about 2 weeks ago and I hadn't heard anything. Have them document all this, document the time that they submitted, like I talked about earlier, the pictures, document the time and look at the progression of the work order being completed. Because sometimes some work orders take steps. It does take steps to get something complete, especially if it's a large repair and parts have to be ordered. So I just want to add that. So find out what the delay. If they say, well, the reason why we cannot fix it is because the fact that we're working on the part, that's legitimate. Document it, the time period, and ask, okay, when do you foresee that part coming in? Document the conversation. And then also find out what your landlord repair laws are in your state. This information, this link will be given to you so you can look it up, because this will dictate what are the steps they can take if the landlord still refuses to do the repair. Again, it's slightly different in each state, but I'm just going to go over some general ones. One thing they can do, you can help them make reports to the local health code and building enforcement department. Nothing gets something done quicker, especially if you're talking about a bed infestation. If you call the code department and they come out and do an inspection, and the landlord or property manager, they get issued a citation, and then they get a time period where they have to correct it. So that's just an example. Say again, the repair is not being done. Again, check your state. Some state allow you to do repair and deduct. if the newcomer does have the money, they said, well, I'm going to just go ahead and do the repair myself. I'm going to go ahead and pay for the repair myself. I'm going to call someone to do it. Make sure that they have the repair deduct is allowable in their state. And if they do, keep all the documentation, all the expenses they spent to get the repair, and then they can submit that to their landlord to get reimbursed. Another thing I've seen done is withheld rent. Before you can do that, you got to make sure you're current on rent. You can't be the tenant or the newcomer can't be 2-3 months behind on rent. And even it could be a legitimate repair and the landlord's not doing it, they cannot withhold rent because they're already delinquent. So that one thing that's not a solution to this. So they do have to be current on rent. If this is one of the solutions they want to rectify the repair not being done. Make sure it meets their state requirements in paying the rent, because some states require you to actually hold that money, that rent money, in an escrow account until the repair is done. You just can't withhold it. You have to show that you actually have money available to pay your rent. So again, make sure you check your state requirements when it comes to withhold rent. And also, you don't want to make sure that you don't get an eviction, okay? If your state does not offer the withhold rent option, your landlord has every right to start the eviction process because you're not paying your rent. They're not paying their rent. And also, there's another option is surrender the property, terminate the lease early. I suggest with this recommendation, this is when the house is inhabitable. I mean, this is where it's not a good living condition. Again, you have to be careful if you walk away and terminate your lease. You have to make sure you document that you asked for the repair to be done. The landlord has disregarded that. And then also that the house is in bad condition before you can actually walk away from the unit or the house. And then contact an attorney. A lot of the attorneys at Legal Aid, they do it on a sliding base fee. So work with your newcomer to find someone who's willing to do it on a sliding base fee, or a lot of them do it for free for the cause, to make sure they know what their rights are and how to progress based on what the repair is. Because if it's something so simple and you're saying, well, I'm not holding my rent because they haven't fixed the knob on the refrigerator now. You got to be realistic. They have to be realistic. So just FYI. These are the things I want to highlight. Again, this is not legal advice. This is just recommendations. Before proceeding with aggressive actions or remedies, you've got to determine, again, does the problem cause the unit or the house to be unsuitable for living? So you have to ask that question. So these are some things you can walk through with your newcomer when you're trying to coach them through the process. And I also recommend that you tell them, hey, I'm not an attorney unless you are an attorney, and say, I am just giving you some information and resources. Even if you're a resettlement staff, you've got to add that caveat in there. I'm not an attorney. I'm just giving you some resources and some options and just talking you through this process. Also, not the fault of the tenant. You got to make sure the repair is not the fault of the tenant or their guest. Was the damage caused deliberately because the tenant or their guest was careless, or because of neglect? Postponing work orders or not getting a work order done can fall under this. And also, you've got to follow your state rules when it comes to notifying your landlord when there is a work order or repair that is needed. And one thing you have to take in consideration, place to relocate, especially if you want to leave the unit. Does that tenant have does that newcomer have the finances to actually up and move? Now, however, if it's because of an issue that the landlord has not addressed, especially if it's a safety and health issue, the landlord is responsible. Some states require the landlord to assist with the relocation expenses. So that's why it's very important that you have them contact legal aid, get legal advice, find out what the state requirements are, because some landlords are required to pay for that expense. So next slide. Next slide, Grace. Grace, next slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I met my time. So I know that was a lot of information, but you are more than welcome to reach out to me. Again, my name is Lynette Pearl. My email is lpearl@cwsglobal.org. And I know Joy, after this webinar in a few days or so, she's very good about getting information out. I will make sure all the links, information you need that we talked about in this webinar will be part of this PowerPoint. And if you have any questions or need me to walk you through anything, feel free to either to schedule a one-on-one TA session with me, or just simply drop me an email. Back to you, Ms. Joy.
Thank you so much, Lynette. Thank you. You've been great. So this is a time where we can answer your questions. I'm looking now at the question box. I don't see questions. So we're going to be proceeding with that. So thank you again, Lynette. Really, you really did great. I love how you broke it down into, like, different pieces. And I think definitely this is something that we have seen a lot with newcomers and with refugees who have been here for a long time. There's just a lot of intimidation when it comes to work orders. Some people don't even know that this is a right, or some people think if they ask the landlord to come and fix something, that can affect their deposit later. Or some people are just, definitely the language barrier also plays a part in that, that they just don't know how to communicate to their landlord what is happening. I love how you brought, emergency situations versus non-emergency situations and the rights to get these things fixed. And definitely a word just to volunteers and sponsors, like, better be safe than sorry. So I would love for you, if you can use this webinar to walk through it with your newcomers or a refugee family that you have been with. I just really love the points that Lynette brought up, and they're very beneficial. And, never assume, right? I think because we live here in the States, we assume that these things, oh, of course they know it. No, sometimes they don't. Many times they don't. Most of the time they don't. So better walk them through it than assume that they already know it. So yeah, thank you so much everyone for attending today's RWC Lunch and Learn webinar. We would like to hear from you and receive your feedback on today's webinar and hear your suggestions for future Lunch and Learn topics. We ask you that you take a minute right now to complete a survey. You have the QR code on the screen, so if you want to use your phone to scan it, and also you can get to us through the link that we have in the chat. You will receive a follow-up email from me with a link of the recording of today's webinar. And on behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your week.